I found out my husband had invited his mistress to my 31st birthday dinner exactly 4 minutes before she walked through the restaurant door, wearing a dress the same shade of red as one hanging in my own closet at home. I had found out I was worth $2.3 billion 2 days before that. The two facts arrived in the same week, and for a long time afterward, I couldn't decide which one had actually changed my life more. For the first 31 years of my life, I was simply Amara Booker, the name my adoptive parents, Gerald and Denise, gave me the day they brought me home from a Philadelphia hospital as a 6-week-old infant. My father spent 31 years as a machinist at a manufacturing plant outside the city. My mother taught 3rd grade at the same elementary school for almost as long. They never hid my adoption from me, not for a second. They told me as soon as I was old enough to understand the word, and every time they told me, they said being chosen was its own kind of love story. I grew up happy, grounded, with no burning need to search for a birth family I'd made peace with never knowing. I married Bryce Whitfield when I was 28. We'd met 2 years earlier at a friend's engagement party, both of us new to Philadelphia's finance scene, both of us hungry in that particular 20-something way. He was charming, quick with a joke, the kind of man who made you feel like the most interesting person in any room. I had no idea, walking down that aisle, how much both halves of my identity were about to be upended in the same single week, 5 years later. I'd noticed things were wrong before that birthday. I just kept finding reasons to explain them away. Later nights at the office. A phone he took into another room. A restaurant receipt I found in his coat pocket 4 months earlier, a dinner for 2 on a night he'd told me he was working late. When I asked, he said it was a client dinner, a colleague from a competing firm he was trying to poach a deal from. I let myself believe it, mostly because the alternative felt like more than I had room for at the time. I didn't yet know her name. I didn't know she worked 3 floors above him in the same building. A marketing associate named Courtney Hale, who Bryce had been seeing for just over a year by the time my birthday arrived. The phone call that changed everything came on an ordinary Tuesday, 2 weeks before my birthday, while I was folding laundry and only half paying attention to an unfamiliar New York area code on my screen. I almost let it go to voicemail. "Is this Amara Booker Whitfield?" a woman's voice asked, careful and professional. "My name is Patricia Reyes. I'm an attorney with Sterling and Hoyt, calling on behalf of the estate of Cordelia Ashworth Marsh." I told her, politely, that she had the wrong number. I'd never heard that name in my life. "I understand this is going to be a shock," Patricia said, gently. "Cordelia Ashworth Marsh was your birth mother, Mrs. Whitfield. She passed away 11 days ago. She spent the last 6 years of her life searching for you. She left you her entire estate." I sat down on the edge of the bed, laundry basket still balanced on my hip, feeling the floor of my whole understanding of my life shift under me. "Her entire estate," I repeated slowly. "Mrs. Whitfield," Patricia said, "your birth mother founded and built Marsh Retail Logistics, one of the largest privately held distribution companies on the East Coast. Her estate, including her controlling stake in the company, is valued at approximately $2.3 billion. All of it, per her explicit final wishes, goes to you." I spent the following week learning about a woman I'd never known existed. Cordelia had been 19, unmarried, and alone when she gave birth to me, placing me for adoption because, as her private journals would later reveal, she genuinely believed at 19 that she had nothing stable enough to offer a child. She built her company from a single regional warehouse, working with a drive Patricia described as unmistakably tied to the daughter she'd given up and spent years believing she didn't deserve to search for. She never married. She never had other children. She submitted her own DNA to a private registry in her 50s, and waited nearly 6 years for a match, one that finally came through just as her health was failing. She died 11 days before Patricia's call. 3 weeks after the match confirmed I was her daughter. I read a letter she'd written me, sealed 8 days before her death, alone in my kitchen at 11 at night, and I cried in a way I hadn't since my adoptive father's funeral 3 years earlier. Grief for a woman I'd never known, layered over a strange, aching gratitude for a sacrifice she'd made at 19 that I was only now beginning to understand. I told no one that week. Not my parents, not my closest friends, and not Bryce. Not out of any calculated plan, but because I needed time to sit with something that enormous before I could say it out loud to anyone. Bryce, that same week, was busy planning something of his own. I'd asked for a small birthday dinner that year, 12 people, nothing extravagant, at a restaurant Bryce suggested himself. He'd seemed unusually invested in the guest list, offering to handle it so I wouldn't have to during a busy week at work. I didn't know, accepting that offer gratefully, that he'd added a name to it that had no business being anywhere near my birthday. I walked into that restaurant carrying the biggest secret of my life, still trying to hold the shape of an inheritance I could barely comprehend, with no idea my husband was about to hand me a second devastation before the night was through. The dinner started warm. I hugged my closest friends as they arrived, made easy conversation with my in-laws, felt something close to normal for the first time in an overwhelming week. Then the door opened, and a woman I didn't recognize walked in, scanning the room before her eyes landed, unmistakably, on Bryce. She wore a dress the exact shade of red as one hanging in my own closet at home, a detail so specific it registered before almost anything else about her. Bryce stood up too quickly and crossed the room toward her. "Everyone," he said, turning back to the table, his voice carrying an artificial brightness that made my stomach drop, "I want you to meet Courtney. She's been an important person in my life this past year, and I wanted her here to celebrate Amara's birthday with us." The table went silent, the specific kind of silence that happens right before everyone at once understands they're witnessing something they were never supposed to see. I looked at my husband, his hand resting at the small of Courtney's back, and understood exactly what he'd done. He hadn't invited her by accident. He'd invited her deliberately, publicly, in front of everyone who mattered to me, a small, cruel exclamation point on however long he'd been planning to leave. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling every eye at the table swing toward me, waiting to see how I'd react. I didn't give him what he was expecting. "Courtney," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's nice to finally put a face to the name. Please, sit." We were just about to order appetizers. I watched Bryce's confident expression flicker with uncertainty. I made it through the rest of that dinner with a calm that surprised even me, while he grew visibly more unsettled by the reaction he clearly hadn't gotten. I left early, claiming a headache, not entirely a lie. I sat in my car in our driveway for 20 minutes before going inside, and made a decision that would shape the following weeks. I wasn't going to confront him that night. Not out of fear. I needed to understand my own new reality first, before I brought him into any part of it. Bryce came home 2 hours later, visibly nervous, his explanation about Courtney shifting twice in the same conversation. First of a work friend he'd misjudged inviting, then, when I stayed quiet, an admission that they'd been seeing each other a few months. A timeline I already suspected was shorter than the truth. I let him talk. I asked careful questions. I gave him no indication of the $2.3 billion sitting in a legal file on Patricia Reyes's desk, waiting for my signature. I wanted to see exactly who he was without that weight in the room yet. Over the following 10 days, working with Patricia and a family law attorney named Vivian Cho, I learned 2 things that reshaped the rest of my life. First, the affair wasn't a few months. It was just over a year, confirmed through a private investigator Vivian recommended, hotel receipts, a consistent pattern, a level of deliberate deception that made the birthday humiliation feel less like a cruel impulse and more like the inevitable endpoint of a year Bryce had spent quietly building his exit. Second, the full scope of what I'd inherited. Not just Cordelia's controlling stake in the company, but real estate holdings, investment accounts, and a private foundation she'd funded for over a decade supporting adoption services and birth mothers across Pennsylvania and New York, a detail that told me more about who she'd truly been than almost anything else in her estate. Vivian, reviewing our marital finances, found something else Bryce had clearly been counting on me never noticing. He'd been quietly moving money out of our joint accounts for months, building a private fund of his own, presumably for the life he was already planning with Courtney, entirely unaware that the wife he was preparing to leave was about to become one of the wealthiest women on the East Coast. I told him everything on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks after the dinner, sitting across from him at our kitchen table with Vivian's paperwork spread between us. "I know about Courtney," I said. "I've known since the dinner. I know it's been over a year, not a few months. I know about the money you've been moving into a separate account. And I need you to know something else before we talk about any of that. I slid Patricia's documents across the table. 2 weeks before you invited your mistress to my birthday dinner to humiliate me in front of everyone I love, I found out my birth mother had died and left me her entire company, $2.3 billion, Bryce. I sat at that table watching you parade her in front of my closest friends, already knowing what was coming, and I said nothing, because I needed to see exactly how far you'd go, and exactly who you really were, before any of this changed anything between us. Bryce stared at the documents. His face moved through disbelief, and then something that looked uncomfortably like calculation. Amara, he said, his voice suddenly different. I think we should talk about this. Really talk. I made a mistake with Courtney, but you and I, we have history. We have a filed petition for divorce, I said, sliding a second document across the table. Vivian completed it on my behalf last week. I'm not here to negotiate reconciliation. I'm here to tell you exactly what you lost the night you decided humiliating me in public mattered more than the marriage you claim to still care about. The divorce moved quickly, though not entirely on his terms. His attorney tried, predictably, to argue for a share of assets connected to my inheritance, a battle Vivian had anticipated and structured our approach specifically to prevent. Because the inheritance arrived after our separation began, and because Vivian moved fast to formally establish that date the same week I filed, the law worked firmly in my favor. Bryce received a standard division of what we'd actually built together over 5 years of marriage. Nothing connected to Cordelia's estate. Not $1 of a fortune he had no idea existed on the night he chose to humiliate me. Courtney ended things with him within a month of the divorce becoming public. I learned that secondhand, through mutual friends, the way I learned most things about Bryce after that point. I understand he's struggled since, financially, adjusting to a life without the assumptions he'd apparently been making, and personally, having lost, in a single reckless night, a marriage he perhaps hadn't wanted to end so much as he'd wanted to control the terms of ending it. I took over as chairwoman of Marsh Retail Logistics 8 months after that birthday dinner, working closely with the company's leadership to honor the kind of careful, principled growth Cordelia had built it around for 3 decades. I expanded her foundation's work significantly in my first year, adding a program to help birth mothers maintain connection with children placed for adoption, when both parties want that connection, built, in large part, as a direct answer to how much Cordelia had wanted and never gotten the chance to know me before it was too late. I reconnected more deeply than ever with my parents, Gerald and Denise. My mother cried when I told her about Cordelia's letter, about the years she'd spent quietly searching. She gave you to us because she loved you enough to want better for you than she believed she could give at 19, my mother told me. And then she spent the rest of her life trying to find her way back to you anyway. That's not 2 different kinds of love, baby. That's the same love, just showing up in the only way she knew how, at every stage of her life. I think about her often, a woman I never met, who built an empire out of a sacrifice she made at 19, who spent her final years quietly searching for a daughter she never stopped loving from a distance she chose because she believed it was right. And I think about the timing, how the same week I learned about a woman who'd spent her life proving her worth without anyone's permission, my own husband tried to make me feel small in front of everyone I loved.